boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today a lead pastor from the Garden Sanctuary Church of God located in Rock Hill, South Carolina. It is a multicultural growing church which is involved with numerous ministries to include pro-life work. This gentleman is also a ghostwriter, an interesting little twist to him. I want to introduce to you today Pastor Patrick Conley. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Philip, it's so good to be on with you today. I'm excited to be on for Rage of the Age. And man, what a fitting name, because it certainly feels like we're in the psalmist writing, the heathen raging, and there's the world around us, man. Wow. So Rage of the Age, here we are, man. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're here. I'm actually surprised I was able to use that name and no one else had it. I was like, this is a mistake. Surely somebody has already had this. But I'm glad you're with me today. And as I've mentioned, you're a pastor at the Garden Sanctuary Church of God in Rock Hill, South Carolina, a growing area. And as you mentioned, a multicultural growing church. How long have you been at that location?
I've actually been at Garden Sanctuary for we're in our third year now. I followed a pastor here. Now, this church, amazingly, is 100 years old. It's almost 110 years old, in fact. But one of the first churches in the state of South Carolina for the Church of God. And I actually followed a long-term pastor here who had done a great job. But my wife and I, we came here 3 years ago. So in our third year, it's been exciting. We've been growing. Incredible area, man. You talked about the growth. We're right outside of Charlotte. Mm-hmm. So we've got growth there. It's crazy. You can leave my house, which is right here near the church, and I can drive 25 minutes and be at the airport, an international airport in Charlotte, or I can go 25, 30 minutes in the other direction and literally be on farms. So It's like, it's an amazing area. I love it here.
Yeah, I've been through that area a few times, actually living in South Carolina for a while. That is growing, but like you said, there's still the geography could change on you in the blink of an eye. You want country, you got it. You want city, you got it. I mean, there's, you can go to the beach, you can run off to the mountains. It's a special location there where you're at. Besides pastoring, you also do ghostwriting, you've told me. Which yes. I've never met an actual ghostwriter, because I guess they're, being a ghost. You don't hear about them whatsoever. You have a blog. You got a podcast called More Than a Conversation.
Yes.
As a pastor, and I'm curious because I kind of have these side ventures going too. I'm not a ghostwriter by any stretch of imagination, but I'm branching out into other things.
Sure.
What made you go that direction? Why'd you pursue those things?
Well, it's interesting because I truly believe that God will guide your steps into whatever your callings and talents are. I spent a lot of time early on in my life doing various things with writing and things like that. And in the corporate world, I used to do some writing, press releases, speeches for the CEO, things like that. And then there was also a time while I was in the corporate world that I was asked to work on at that time there were webcasts, podcasts, whatever you want to call them, but it was kind of like web radio.
Yes,
as this whole venture was getting going. And so I did that for secular purposes in the corporate world. And then when I started pastoring and left that world, I was writing some devotions. And as I was writing these devotions, putting them out for my church, a pastor who had wanted to write a book, but wasn't confident about putting everything into book form, asked a mutual acquaintance, hey, does that guy do any ghostwriting? And I thought, well, what's that look like for us? So we talked about it. It started from there, and then it branched out. So literally it was somebody who I'd never met calling me up to see if I'd be willing to work on a project. And then with the podcasting, actually, it was something I wanted to do, thought about doing. I had, again, done the webcast back in the day and stuff. And my wife goes, you need to do that. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't really, nobody wants to listen. I'm not really interested in doing all that, just all the stuff. And so Actually, a year ago, my birthday is in 6 days. And a year ago, for my birthday, my wife bought me some podcasting equipment and goes, no, it's time to get that going. And so that came out of that. Honestly, the writing just kind of birthed out of something I enjoy doing. I enjoy writing. And there's a lot of people out there, whether they be, and I've worked with everyone from pastors to corporate people to worked on consulting on books about a wide variety of topics. And a lot of people just aren't confident in getting that written flow. And so it just worked out. And of course, I love to read. I'm a huge believer that leaders are readers. And, my goal this year is my goal originally was to try to knock out about 100 books this year. And I'm thinking I'm going to hit that this year, but modeling that Spurgeon, read 300 books a year or whatever his number was. That being said, reading is a huge part of writing. As you're taking in that content, it just enables you to see the flow of literature and so on and so forth. So yeah, a lot of those things, man, they just kind of came. I didn't go searching for them. They just kind of showed up, and it was just God sending things at the right time to enable things to go forward and use that gifting.
So when you launched your podcast, because you sound like you are like most podcasters, you're at that threshold of whether I should or should not. Obviously, your wife sounds like the main mover of pushing you into that direction to go. God bless her for it. But when you were starting that, and did you have an idea of like what was the goal of the podcast? What was the kind of the themes you were going to look to talk about? What was you going to accomplish with it?
The idea for me was I did not want a leadership podcast.
Yeah.
Because there's a million leadership podcasts, right? And I didn't want a pastor's podcast. I mean, I'm already writing devotions. People can hear me preach. They can hear me teach. Those things are available. I didn't want to get in. I didn't want to do that. But what I wanted to do was have conversations, which is why it's more than a conversation. Mm-hmm. We as a people have lost the ability to have conversation. We developed this rule that you shouldn't talk about religion, you shouldn't talk about politics. And instead of we didn't gain a nicer society. Look around. We actually just gained a society that doesn't know how to disagree, that doesn't know how to have conversation,
right?
That doesn't know how to explore topics. I also knew I didn't want to do interviews. I wanted to talk to people. Another thing is there's a lot of people out there that I wanted to have conversations with that I'm like, there's no way I'm going to get that guy on the phone just to talk to me. Right. But if I've got a podcast, man, I can have conversation. I've had some incredible guests and interesting people. But the beauty of it is I feel like, I'm sure you've had these things, like these conversations where you are talking to somebody and, while you're talking to him, you're like, man, we just had an incredible conversation. I wish so-and-so could have heard this. Yes. Or I wish or somebody, a church member will come up and go, what do you think about this? And you go, I was just talking to this guy the other day who's an expert in that field. And so now it was just an opportunity to be able to let that happen. But I wanted to make sure that it was a podcast that was it's not a Christian podcast. There's a lot of pastors, there's a lot of Christian authors, there's a lot of Christian speakers, but I'm a Christian. And so that flows into all I do. But the goal wasn't to have something churchy, which is why I think in most places it's categorized in like the society or philosophy sections and things like that. Because my idea was, hey, let me talk to interesting people and let's see where they're coming from. Let's see where I'm coming from. And let's have a conversation and see where it goes. So that's kind of the idea was to just have organic conversations that flowed, that got beyond the idea of just a list of questions and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. I definitely agree with your approach and the statement of the society has this. Well, I can't say unwritten rule, it's probably written too. Don't have conversations about politics and religion. But I have ironically seen that those who say that are the ones who themselves obsess about talking about politics and religion. They just don't want to hear your side of the story. And there's no conversation, like you said. And I don't, in a similar vein, this podcast was meant to have those two open up ideas and address. I like addressing paradigms, especially in the essay segment of this show, where I compare people's paradigms, why they're thinking what they're thinking, and trying to get the root of why we're going the way we're heading on certain things. Conversation should do that, but oftentimes, like you said, we shut things down.
Well, we live in this world that is very much the snippet mode. It's the let's put somebody on TV. Let's put three heads up there. We got the moderator in the middle, who's got their bias, and then you've got somebody on each side. And here you've got 90 seconds to explain your solution to a problem that took 200 years to create. And then this person's got 30 seconds to give a retort to make you look dumb, and then try to come up with a reply. And so we just end up with nothing getting said because all you're trying to do is come up with a tweetable moment instead of having real conversations. And at the end of the day, the other thing that I think is missing is nuance. Like, not everything is cut and dry. There are people out there that I can't listen to that are commentators that say a lot of things I agree with, but I can't give them any respect because they never say anything that is off the extreme script of whatever group they're in.
Yes.
And at the end of the day, no matter how conservative you are, there's some things where you go, well, you know what? I don't really know the answer to that. And there's not something in my side, or however liberal you are,
Right.
There's something. Okay, so let's just take life. Let's take the most liberal person in the world regarding life and regarding abortion, or a person. I'm not going to say the most liberal person in the world. Again, let me nuance that. Let's just take the average person that thinks abortion is an option. Okay, you sit down with that person, you have a conversation. Eventually, there comes a point where they go, man, partial birth abortion is a little different than, and I'm not saying it's different. I think it's all the same. I think, I think it's a murder all the way through. That being said, but for that person, they have to come to the point where they go, I really believe in choice, but man, I don't know, man, that's a baby right there. So what am I, and then going to the other side, we could take the conservative side and talk about what happens at the border. And, that's another issue because we're talking about life. We'll go, well, yeah, I believe absolutely that we need to have legal immigration, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, for me to sit here and in 30 seconds tell you the solution to kids at the border or the solution to the dreamers, that stuff just doesn't come down. And whenever we're in these camps and we just go, well, this is the answer of my party. And the problem is, as Christians, especially, we don't fit into a camp. We don't come down on a side. Tim Keller actually talked about that, how there's 4 major issues today in politics that have been co-opted that are actually moral issues. And right now in America, 4 things need to be talked about. We need to talk about abortion. We need to talk about race. We need to talk about how to deal with the poor. And we need to talk about sexuality. And what's interesting is, depending on whether you're conservative or liberal, typically the parties have taken 2 of those topics and churches have taken 2 of those topics. So if I go to a more quote unquote liberal church and I preach about taking care of the poor, they're like, yeah, that's great. That's awesome. But then I go, okay, well, the Bible also says this about sexuality and homosexuality and gender. And then suddenly, we don't like that. But then I go to a conservative church, like a church in my region, most of them are. And I go, let's talk about abortion. Everybody's like, yes, let's talk about abortion. And then I go, okay, well, let's talk about caring for the poor. Let's talk about race or whatever. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, that's not really, as high of a priority. And so those 4 topics, they don't fit the donkey or the elephant. But as people of the Lamb, we have to talk about those. And so again, that's where this comes in, is the idea of nuance, understanding that as believers we don't fit in, and understanding that all these topics are not as easy to figure out as everyone makes them out to be.
There's definitely some layers to everything that you're talking about, of course.
Sure.
So when you became a minister, from what it sounded like, you were on the secular heathen path. Maybe you were pagan. I don't know, whatever it was for you, right? You had a conversion, and then at some point you felt led into the ministry. What other than saying the classic, well, God led me, what was that route like to get you into the ministry? What drew you there?
When I was 12 years old, I grew up in church, so I grew up in the church. But when I was 12 years old, I was in my room, I was praying. As I'm in my room, I'm praying as a young man. I had this this time of sincerity. And God laid on my heart then that I was going to be a minister of the gospel. And God showed me then a reach that didn't match anything that I'd ever seen in the churches I'd grown up in, as far as just the scope of what God showed me myself ministering to a group of people. And so I was like, man, this is amazing. God put this thing in my heart, but I was like, well, what do I do with it? Well, you're going to preach. So what I did, I went to my great grandparents and I asked them if I could borrow some money. And I borrowed I want to say it's like $100. And that $100 got me a Dake study Bible and the case, the big old Dake, right?
Yeah.
And the case. And so I'm 12 years old and I've got this study Bible. Well, I thought this is a path I want to take or whatever. And as a teenager, there was a couple times of, hey, we're having this rally, or some of the young guys in the church are going to speak tonight. Can you do something? And so I did that stuff. But honestly, my heart was very torn in those ages, those teenage years.
Yes.
And actually, there came a point where things just didn't make sense to me. And the way I was raised, as many people are, was kind of don't ask questions. I had to ask questions because this stuff didn't make sense. And that's one of the reasons I believe so much in apologetics. We've got to be able to answer the questions of the generation we're dealing with. And so I actually walked away from the faith. I said, you know what? I don't want anything to do with this. It doesn't make sense. It's not logical. And really just pushed aside this idea that God had called me to do something. That being said, even as a sinner, and I don't want to give any glory to the enemy, so I don't even want to go into that whole story, but I went as deep and as hard as a person could go towards trying to destroy my life, really, as a young man. And God had a way of pulling me back, and He did, thankfully. And the moment that I prayed for God to forgive me of my sins, actually my prayer was, God, if I were you, I wouldn't save me. I've already had a chance. I already knew I've blown it. I said, if I were you, I wouldn't save me. But if you will, I'll give you the rest of my life. And I got saved on a Friday morning, and there was a youth rally that night. And so I went to that youth rally that night, and a pastor I'd never met, never laid eyes on him before. In fact, I may have seen him twice since then, but I'd never met him. He didn't know me from anybody. He calls me up to the front of this packed church, this youth rally, multiple churches there. And he spoke some words over me that were telling about what God was saying to me in that time. And it was on point, man. And this guy, again, didn't know me from anybody. And there was no way anyone who could have told him anything about me, because I showed up for service that night with no one knowing I was coming. Mm-hmm. Everyone that I knew of me as a heathen, and I had been an utter heathen until that morning, And so I go into this service, and that happens. Well, then people immediately, because they knew that, as a young man, I had this calling, and people start asking, well, what are you going to do? When are you going to preach? And I was, you know what? I didn't want to do that. And I said, there's no way. I said, right now I need to know God. I want to grow in God. And people kept asking, no, I want to grow in God. And so it actually ended up being over a year that I was saved as a young man. I would go to work. I was in the corporate world then, actually, or got into the corporate world. I was kind of working a menial job before then, labor. And God began to bless me as a Christian, and I got a great job. But I would go to work, and then after I got off work, I would just come home and I would literally study the Bible. That's what I did. And God began to show me Himself in ways that didn't match the way I was raised to know Him. And I began to discover the truths of the Scripture for myself, and that's what my life was: go to work, come home, do the study. And after about a year and a couple months of that, the pastor goes, hey, we're having a watch night service, the New Year's Eve service. Would you like to speak? And they had several guys speaking. And I said, okay. And so I did. And from there, things just moved forward. Eventually, I evangelized, did youth pastoring, became a pastor, so on and so forth. So to the idea of knowing, God put it in me. I ran from it. And then coming back, it was just one of those things that I would say now I know I was not to be pretentious at all, but this is what I was created for, man, is getting in that book and then communicating that to other people.
Well, I absolutely agree. You're doing what you were created to do. I believe more honest pastors who are actually called are ones who didn't want to do it in the first place. That's my honest conclusion. With the ministry. You've been at Garden Sanctuary Church of God for about 3 years. Is that right?
Yeah. We're in our third year. Yep.
How has that how's that ministry been to you? What kind of was that a fast learning curve? Are you still not knowing what you're doing? I mean, how's it playing out for you?
Well, we're in the business of the eternal salvation of souls, so I'm sure none of us really know what we're doing. But no, this church, we were blessed in that the church was established and had structure, and there was some good things and systems that were in place that helped us to build. When I got here, my goal was helping a church that had been established see the future and see a revival atmosphere. And so since I've been here, we've seen our younger demographic begin to grow in younger families. We've really begun to experience an outpouring of God's Spirit in our services. And just, sometimes when a church goes through transition, it's like a business going through transition. It's like anything else. The old saying is a change is as good as a rest sometimes. And so sometimes for ministers, a change makes them feel like they've had a rest. Well, also for a church, there's some reinvigoration that comes sometimes from a change that doesn't mean that there wasn't anything good happening before. In fact, what's amazing is the pastor I followed, he's still a member here, but he works in the state office for the Church of God now. Okay. But he did a great job, and the people love him and he loves them. It was just God's timing after 25 years for him to move forward. So I'm beyond blessed in that I didn't come into a problem, a mess. We hated this guy, any of those things. I came into it was God's time. The church goes, okay, we love him, but it was God's time. I could not have asked for a better transition coming to Garden Sanctuary, to tell you the truth. It's the kind of transition that you go, Lord, there's a lot of things in pastoring you go, what did I do to deserve this? But in this case, it's God, how on earth did I ever have something go as well and as smooth as this did? So no complaints on that side, man. It's been great. The people have been great. It's been awesome all around. The other thing is that where I was pastoring was a very homogenous church in a smaller town. And just even from the way I was raised to the people I'm used to being around, to the type of ministry that I truly enjoy doing, there were a lot of benefits in being in a bigger town, a more multicultural town, a town that was a little different pace. And so truly we've just fit here so well. We've loved it.
That's good. So the ministries then that you've been doing over the past 2 years, you mentioned reaching the youth, for example, and we've established that you're a multicultural church, a growing church. Not like there's a formula too, but can you explain what's the ministry been like there that has had the impact that you're seeing? What do you think are some of the things that have been to your benefit?
I would say to our benefit, some of the things have been reaching younger families. First of all, we have increased some of our outreach ministry, not in let's have an event for people to come to. In fact, we've ended some of that, to be honest with you. For example, one of the things that the church had done for years was they had this huge fall festival.
Right.
Great thing, have a fall festival. But the issue with fall festivals, as far as in church goes, is everyone in town has a fall festival. Yes. So you're not really doing anything unique. And you'd have, 800 people show up at fall festival and none of them show up at church. Right. None of them have this lasting impact or contact. And so for me, I think that all of our decisions in ministry should be based upon trying to have the greatest impact and the best stewardship of our resources. And so that was one of the things that we said, hey, let's do something else. So we adjusted that, but we've increased our outreach in the community with like doing a warming shelter in the wintertime for some of the less advantaged men. We're involved now in a couple different shelters, one of which is like a battered women's shelter. We're involved in with connections to a men's shelter, things like that. We do some painting, and now that was something that was going on before, was the painting houses and that sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
In our town, we have something called Rock Hill Rolls, which is they go out and paint homes that need to be painted to help a neighborhood. And so we started doing things like that and getting more involved in things like that. We've got involved with the Wounded Warriors Ride. We've done Buy a Tree, Change a Life here, just different things that enable us to reach out and make an impact. And also, this generation wants to see practical Christianity in a way that previous generations maybe didn't. Oftentimes, previous generations Christianity was go to church, have a good time in church, go home, live a good, clean life, then go back to church, have a good time in church, and go home. Whereas millennials and generations like that, not only do they want to be involved in a church that is doing those things, they're less likely to give in general to a church, but more likely to give towards a cause than many generations before. And so it's enabled us to let people see their Christianity be put into practice. We're involved with Love Life, where we go and do the prayer walks at the abortion clinic and so on and so forth. And so allowing us to get our hands engaged in things. The other thing that I think that has helped spur our growth is, honestly, oftentimes younger people will be attracted to a church with younger leadership. That obviously happens. And I try my best to be very, very practical in my preaching. And I do a lot of expository preaching. I like to preach an expository style, but I do it, or an expository message with a Pentecostal style would be what I would call it. Yeah. But I also I like to take those deep truths and bring them down to a practical level. And honestly, I'm going to get as candid and as truthful as I can, because at the end of the day, that's another thing that our generation. And I'm technically a millennial, but the generation I'm in and the generations that are coming, they are in a world that is telling them there is no absolute truth,
right? That
nothing is absolute. So the one thing that can cut through that is when we come with absolute truths. Now, here's the thing. We've got to make sure that we're biblical. We've got to make sure that we can explain it. We've got to make sure that it makes sense. We got to make sure that we're not just speaking off the cuff. But when you find a truth, declare it plainly, and that attracts people, because we then are the only entity, and I'm not saying compared to other churches, but I mean the church is the only entity that's declaring anything absolute in a world where they're saying nothing is absolute, and people are screaming, please give me something rock solid to hold on to.
I hope you are enjoying today's episode. If you enjoy the episodes and the contents that you are receiving from Rage of the Age, I want to encourage you to leave a review stating so. There's a possibility that you may receive a copy of my book, Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire. Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire is a first-hand account of a combat infantryman deployed to Iraq, and it is full of spiritual insights. If you enjoy Rage of the Age, leave a review by going to Facebook, find the page Rage of the Age, click on Reviews, recommend us, and write your review. Or you can go to Twitter, write your review, hashtag it Rage of the Age now. I look forward to giving away a copy of my book, Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire, for free to someone next week.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
So you caught my good air there for a moment. We do, I guess, officially, philosophically, even with the teaching of higher learning and everything, the ideas put out there, there's no truth. It's perception. Your perception is reality. You look at an elephant one way, they see it another sort of type of thing. But then there comes a guy along named Patrick saying, no, there's absolute truth. But you're saying that the generations that you're speaking to that are coming up, and a good part of the country, even though they're being told there's no truth, want to hear absolute truth?
Yeah, I think anytime you have people that have been told that there is nothing solid for them to hold on to, everywhere they go, well, how do I build my life on there is no truth? How do I? It doesn't make logical sense. And at the bottom of a person's psyche, at the foundation, there has to be something solid to build on. There's got to be something there. And honestly, what we're seeing right now for a lot of people is we're seeing society going a bridge too far, if you will. Because, for example, the gender issue. Well, now there are secular people that are pushing back on the idea of, 783 genders or whatever there is. And all this, for example, one of the biggest voices out there now is Jordan Peterson, who's not Christian by any means. He uses a lot of Christian or religious concepts and things he talks about, but I don't think he claims to be a believer. But Jordan Peterson, he comes out into a world that says there is no hierarchy and says baloney. There's hierarchy everywhere. There's no way to avoid it. The moment two people do an activity, one of them is going to be better than the other one. That's right. And people are suddenly attracted to that. At the same time, he comes out and gives us, hey, there's got to be some rules and some ideas and philosophies that we live by. And so what's happened is you've got this constant swirl where there is no truth. Well, that just doesn't work for living. It's nice to be able to say, it's nice to be able to talk about, but at the end of the day, the person that looks at you and goes, well, there is really no right or wrong. Well, okay, wait till somebody steals their purse.
Right.
Well, now is there a right or wrong? The same guy who gets in line at the debate to tell somebody that there is no such thing as right or wrong will say it's wrong that someone cut in line in front of him.
That's right.
Well, where are you getting that measured? Well, there's only one thing in the world. I guess there's maybe two. You could be a Platonist and say that there's just absolute morality that exists as some metaphysical essence outside of explanation, or you can say that there's an eternal, omniscient creator and moral lawgiver. The idea, animals, is what we've been told that we are. Well, now, if we're just animals, then why is it wrong when people act like animals?
Right.
And I think we actually have a perfect example in like the George Floyd situation, because everyone looked at that as that. I say everyone, the majority of people looked at that and saw a guy laying there dying while begging to be let up. And we could talk about I'm not talking about motives or any of that other stuff, but just the act that there's a guy laying there saying, hey, please help me breathe. And the fact that there seemed to be no absolute empathy at all in that moment, almost everyone looked at that and goes, that's not right.
That's wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's wrong. Why? Why is that wrong?
Exactly. That's a good question.
Is it wrong? But, why is it wrong? And maybe that's, in fact, I'm writing a note now. Maybe that's my next blog post, right?
Well, it's a good thing. And I've had numerous, not just on podcasts, but numerous conversations with people through the years on this concept of where morality comes from. And they start out, like you say, well, there's no absolute truths or rights or wrongs, or you can't impose your morality on another type of idea. But when I try to get them to explain what is the source then of your morality, they don't know how to explain it. And if they start to maybe make a stand on something, it's quickly shown that then that evaporates their original premise of you can't have an absolute morality.
Yes.
And they keep doing that circle. I find it sometimes, well, most of them are, because they're friends, I can talk with them and have good conversations. But on a national level, it seems almost as if you're speaking to a brick wall about the issues of morality. I like to hear that you're saying that there are numerous people out there who have been told this, but even if intellectually they accepted it, they're not really accepting it, right?
Yeah, I think the people have been told, and they've accepted something in concept that in theory, in practice, they're not accepting. For example, today, headline in our town, we're at Winthrop University. Winthrop trustees have requested that the name of Tilman Hall be changed because of the racist background of the man after it was named.
Right.
Okay, why? Because there's a moral issue. All right, great. So whatever it is, people, okay, you can go all the way out to Seattle, where you've got whatever they're calling it now, CHOP, Chaz, whatever, anarchy, whatever's happened, this armed uprising, this armed socialist rebellion that's happening in Seattle. You go there and they go, well, we think that the police are wrong. Well, based on what?
Right.
You have an absolute morality. In fact, the very idea that you ought not impose your morality on others is a moral statement that you're seeking to impose upon others.
That's right.
It is, the entirety of it is a self-defeating statement. When someone says, I don't believe in absolute truth. Well, the instant answer, as Frank Turek says, is, well, is that absolutely true?
Exactly.
If there is no truth, well, is that true? And so it's a self-defeating statement. Mm-hmm. And I think there are people that are starting to see through it. Unfortunately, what's happening is the other issue we've got going on is we live in this polarized world where it seems like the clarity and it's wrong, but the clarity is coming from the two extremes. And so people are gravitating to two extremes rather than saying, hey, you can have a list, you can have ethics and absolute morals and still have nuance and still understand. Norm Geisler had a great work on Christian ethics where he talks about weighted ethics and weighted, basically you have a weighted morality where you know that there's rights and wrongs and how are we going to navigate this? Well, we've got to have that system. And ultimately, every human being you meet has a moral system that they're operating by. We just have to get them to understand that. And at the end of the day, I think one of the areas Christianity missed out on is just not recognizing how logical Christianity actually is. I
agree with that. Yeah, for the longest time of my life, the assumption was, and I believed it, was that those who were religious minded were not scientifically minded. They weren't right. They were believing what they wanted to believe fervently, which made them special in a case. But when it came to actual facts and figures, they weren't so good. I mean, that was kind of my impression. And honestly, they didn't help to alleviate the impression on my mind. Since then, I have found the Christian faith to be absolutely logical, and it is defensible. It is legitimate in so many realms. And it's comforting to me, because it totally shattered what kept me from even looking to the Christian truth anyway. But speaking about the church today, though, we've talked about society at large. What's your take on the church? I want to quote you real quick from something you've put out there. And this wasn't you as a ghostwriter, this has your name on it, by the way.
Gotcha.
But you wrote, some describe the president's use of the Bible in a photo, saying he used it as a prop. I can't imagine why that would be offensive to us. The average American Christian has used the building as but a selfie backdrop and the Bible as mere decor for years. What would you mean by all
that? That's that quote definitely got some attention.
Yes, sir.
That was actually a direct quote from a sermon. But here's the deal. I was using the president. So first of all, let me throw the president side out of it, because I was using him just as hey, let's look at what he did. Oh, there's all this outrage. Okay. So now we get to the actual point.
Sure.
The point is, Americans have gone to church without being the church for decades. We've supposedly read the Bible without conforming to the Bible for decades.
Yes.
Why? I mean, we live in a world that says you can be anything and Christian. There are definitive lists in the New Testament that say these are the works of the flesh.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we constantly have people that carry those things out, and we go, hey, it doesn't matter because somehow we've got this ambiguous idea of what it is to be a Christian, when being a Christian is pretty plain in the scripture. Right now, I was actually in North Carolina when I was a youth pastor in North Carolina when North Carolina passed its law regarding homosexual marriage, and people were happy that North Carolina had voted down. Obviously, since then, the Supreme Court has obviously overturned all such laws. But I remember that night, the next service we were in, that I spoke. I said, we're celebrating that, and people are happy about a vote that they made. But at the same time, we've got our kids and grandkids shacking up in our house. Mm-hmm. And that's not popular to say in 2020, right. Yeah. But that's not biblical. That's not Christian. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, buts. Fornication is not Christian. Adultery is not Christian. We looked at the world and said they're destroying marriage. Well, actually, when we took away the sanctity of marriage in the pulpits and in the pew, regarding no fault divorce and just we can't get along, so we're gonna break up, and we lost our value in marriage when we lost our teaching of sexual ethic. Well, suddenly we look at the world and say, well, look what they're doing. Well, the church lost it long before them, and so I think for me, when I look at that statement, I mean, why are we coming to church if we're not going to be the church, if we're not going to be involved in reaching into our community and seeing other people? There are people every Sunday that go to church. Now, do you pastor?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you pastor. So every Sunday, there are people that probably come to your church, unless it's better than my church, and it may very well be, but there's probably people that come to your church that really don't care if they see a sinner come in and be saved, that really don't care if they see revival. I mean, every church that I've ever seen has had people like that, from the most conservative to the most liberal churches, from Pentecostal churches to Baptist churches to whatever it might be. There have been people that they just really don't care. Church, it's cultural Christianity. They go to church because that's what they do. Well, my point in that quote is, well, what's the point of even doing it? What's the point? We're using the building. Oh, it looks cool. Oh, Sunday selfie, hashtag we're at church, hashtag join us. You don't care if they came to church with you. If you did, you wouldn't be at home gossiping about your pastor. You wouldn't be tearing down the church leadership if you really wanted your family to be there. Or you wouldn't be at the restaurant right after church on Sunday being mean to the waiter or waitress if you really cared about your Christian witness. And then as far as the scripture is concerned, we talk about the sexual ethic. We can talk about the American church is covetous to the point that people can bury themselves in debt that makes them slaves to the lender, to the point that they can barely breathe. And we'll stand outside the church when they pull in the vehicle that they just lock themselves to for the next 6 years and goes, my, how the Lord has blessed you, even though the scripture condemns both covetousness and debt. And so what's the point if we're not going to live it? And so I think what we've done with the Bible is we treat the Bible's it's like an old map, right? Like I love Civil War history, and like I've got some maps and such. In fact, I'm looking at a map of the world across the office from right now. But like you look at those old Civil War maps, that's the way we treat the Bible. It's cute. It's something that it's beautiful. It's something that you hang on the wall. It's something you put on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker. But it kind of describes, like that old Civil War map, it tells you how to navigate a world that doesn't exist anymore. That's the way we treat it.
Right. And
so now it's got some great, nice quotes, some stuff that sounds good, but we don't really shape our lives by it. And so that is essentially what that quote means. The president used it as a prop. The average church member has been using God as a prop for a long time. Let's not pretend that he did something we don't do.
Well, I guess that's in essence what you're saying is you're complaining someone's not really a Christian, but that's coming from someone who's maybe not really a Christian, right?
Well, and honestly, I think it's not even the people that are complaining. It's even the people that are applauding, which would probably be a lot of the people in our region of the country that go, oh yeah, that's great. I'm glad for what he did. I just want them to take a moment and go, wait a second. outside of what he did, let's look at what we're doing. And does the Bible actually shape our worldview? I mean, how many believers have been in church right now? How many believers, if you took a poll of your church and they weren't allowed to lie, you put them on a polygraph, how many of them have ever read the Bible cover to cover?
Yeah.
How many of them have daily Bible reading right now? How many of them are thinking biblically about the things they do? And for me, if I wasn't going to be all in, I guess that's the thing. When it got proved to me logically, when I really accepted, hey, this is the truth. Well, if it's actually the truth, then it needs to govern every part of my life. Otherwise, what's the point, man? And so, I'm not saying that means everybody's going to arrive at perfection, because certainly we're not. We're not. No one's going to be able to keep the whole law, or else there'd be no need for Jesus. And we understand that. But as believers, at what point do we go, no, that's just not Christian. No, that just doesn't fit the Christian way. And the problem is now we've made so many cultural allowances that right now, for example, the average church in America, the average conservative church in America, however you want to call it, they stand against things like homosexuality. But that's going to change. That's going to change. It's going to change because their worldview is already not biblical. Right now, they're only standing against it because it's cultural and because they're not comfortable with it. But eventually, it'll be their child or their grandchild or their family member or their neighbor, and they'll be comfortable with it, and that'll change because they're not basing their life on the absolutes of Scripture.
I want to ask you this final question as we close out this segment here, brother. I appreciate so far everything you've shared with us today. If things continue and you kind of hinted at this, if things continue as they are now and the church stays as it is, do you see bad tidings for the church in this country, its influence, its ability to make the Great Commission, or you think we can sail the ship as it is right now?
Okay, well, let me. That's quite a question, and so let me make sure I answer this as correctly as possible. I see no bad tidings for the church.
Yes, sir. Yes.
I see the bride of Christ, them that love God and are the called according to his purpose, them who are, remember the scripture says, to them that believe, we're given the power to be called the sons of God. But then he says, them that obey, they are the sons of God, right? And so there are, the people that are engaged in the faith, no, I don't think I don't see bad tidings as far as that's concerned. And in fact, I don't even know that I see really numerical decline in actual believers. I think we're going to see growth in the number of actual believers. I think what we're going to see decline is in cultural Christianity. As Christianity becomes more and more pushed aside, as Christianity becomes more and more bigoted, is what the world's going to call us, and the world is going to say that Christianity is narrow-minded. I think a lot of people that just come to church because it's what they do, or it's because what their culture is, well, it's going to be a whole lot more comfortable just to go to the lake on Sunday or whatever, because Christianity becomes unpopular, the people that don't love Christ are going to fall away. There's a reason Jesus stops the crowd and says, hey, before you follow me, you better count the cost, because nobody starts a tower without price. You know what I'm saying? He looks at the multitude and says, think about what this is going to cost you. And so for most Christians in America, being a Christian has never cost them anything. In fact, being a Christian has blessed them because they followed some of the principles like hard work and giving to others and just some of those things that are a part of being a Christian, and it has blessed their life by being a Christian. It saved some marriages because, it kept people in the marriage. It's made some children better by having them raised with some morals. And so Christianity has never cost a lot of people in America anything. But there will come the day where that cost will come in. And so you'll see some of them falling aside. But at the same time, there is a generation that is raising up that wants real revival, that wants a real experience with God, that really wants to experience the power of God, that wants to experience truth, that is willing to pray and sacrifice and seek God. And so maybe church isn't going to be bloated programs, and maybe it's not going to be, again, cultural Christians. If you're a cultural Christian, this ain't the place. Dress up time is going to end in America. I do believe that. Putting on the uniform is going to end. maybe stolen valor is going to end. The idea that you say I'm a Christian, oh, I go to church, and that's going to end. That crowd's going to go away. But there is a crowd that is rising up, and I believe it's among our young people. We have the most pro-life generation we have ever had. Okay. That's happening right now. That's based upon honestly, a lot of that's based upon science and technology revealing that you can truly see a baby in the womb. That being said, though, the logic of things is going to come. Society always swings. It always does. Now, we know that anything left to itself obviously ends up in disarray, but we see a society that is marching away from God. But at the same time, there is a cry for truth that is rising up. And we are the only ones with the answer. And that's it. We are the only ones. In fact, when people start searching for absolute truths, there's only three places to go, and that's in the world's large monotheistic religions. And of those three, there's only one that offers the atonement, that offers redemption, that offers that personal relationship with God that people know they need. And Christianity is the only one that has an historically verifiable resurrection that proves the truth of our belief. So what the church has got to do is be prepared to answer the questions of our youth. We've got to start training people to handle the apologetic issues. The idea of that all they need is an experience, that's not going to cut it anymore. We've got to have our young people trained. We've got to have our kids trained. One of our mottos that we're trying to operate under here is in children's church. In elementary school, we're going to win their hearts. And in middle school and high school, we're going to train their minds. That way, when they go out, they can't, as Frank Turek says, they're being talked out of their faith because they were never talked into it. Yeah. So we've got to close the back door on the loss of our young people by giving them real training and real answers and understanding there are real objections, but we have real truth. And then recognize that church is going to look different than it did. We're going to have a generation that doesn't know anything about the traditions of church and the generational things of church, and they really don't care. They could care less about pews and stained glass, and honestly, they could care less about flashing lights and smoke. None of that stuff matters. That's all cultural. That's all style. Right. What they care about is giving them truth. And once they have that truth, and they begin to accept that truth, giving them experiences, and then giving them experiences that make them question, and then you have the truth. But you have to have the experience and the truth marching along together. So to answer your question, I see bad tidings for the ship of cultural Christianity. It's going to go away, but it is the chaff. It is the tares. Mm-hmm. We're not going to have to sort it out. It's going to sort itself out. We know that, but he is going to have a church, and I truly believe that we've not seen the end of the church. If anything, I think what we've seen is we are going to see the revealing. A lot of people said going into 2020, they talked about vision. And I truly believed going into the year, it was going to be a year that we were going to see things clearly. I truly thought that. And the fact of the matter is, I think we are, because we're seeing a lot of things revealed, hidden motives of the heart, hidden intents, things that were operating in the dark are being brought to light. And I think it's going to happen in the church. I think we're going to see a revealing. I think cultural Christianity is on the decline. Casual Christianity is on the decline. Weekend warrior Christianity is going to be gone, but the church is going to be victorious. And I think we're going to see a spirit-filled, community-involved, powerful church in the days ahead. That's what I believe.
Patrick, I appreciate your passion. If there's one thing you can't be accused of is that you don't believe what you're saying. It's obvious that what you're saying, you truly believe it to be true, and you can connect those dots. This isn't a dry philosophical defense for you. This is something you absolutely believe in. And I thank you and appreciate you for talking with us today.
Yes, sir. It was an honor to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Now it's time for the question of the week. Last week's question of the week was, should we have term limits for Congress? And I want to highlight a response by a Michael Peschel who answered yes with all caps. It wasn't intended to be a profession. Once in, they serve themselves and become power and money hungry. The idea of a profession as a politician, it has been an offense to many in recent years. I can definitely understand your response. I want to talk about this week's question of the week now. This week's question of the week is, Is truth relative, or is there absolute truth? I'll post that question on Twitter, which you can find at Rage of the Age now. I'll also post it on the Facebook page, Rage of the Age. Find the question, respond to it, and next week I will highlight somebody's response. Again, the question of the week is truth relative, or are there absolute truths?
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Welcome to this week's essay segment. As you were listening to our conversation today with Patrick Conley, something may have stuck out to you as far as a concept that has been perpetrated throughout most of academia and throughout all influences within the nation, and is this concept about morality and absolute truth. And this concept is there are no absolutes, that everything is only relative, reality is relative, and certainly you can't presume to push your morality or your quote-unquote certainties onto somebody else. Now, this sounds quite charming, and they present this in a way that is very appealing to those who hear it. Young, impressionable students often receive this, and of course, with very little life experience to challenge it, take it in stride and assume, well, this must be true. The PhD, doctorate professor says so. The textbook, which is usually funded and sanctioned and even kind of pushed by the federal government, says so. Therefore, I guess it's true. It makes sense. And of course, there's no counter in this idea that they're selling. And it's a popular idea if you want to guard your particular views and actions to a position where no one is allowed to challenge them and thus challenge you. But if you notice, that has not eliminated challenge. It not has eliminated the notion that someone can stand up and say, that's wrong or that's right. Because when the arguments of what is right and wrong come up, you don't ever really hear, well, you can't say that. This is my truth and that's your truth. We're both right. Obviously, somebody has got to be wrong and somebody has got to be right. As Patrick had asserted to, it's not a very practical philosophy, and it is not one that can truly be lived out. It is quite frustrating, actually. I mean, you can't take that and say, you know, that was the most inspiring quote of my whole life. I'm going to live my life by it. You absolutely can't. You're not going to go through life and go, well, I guess that's what you think is right, when you know it's screaming inside of you, no, it's wrong. But then that brings us to the question of, what is absolute then? What are the truths? Can we know these truths? Or are we forever stuck in a world where it's the blind leading the blind, saying, well, you don't know, I don't know, we'll just wing it as we go? Or is there actually something to grasp onto that we can have a certainty of? I think most of us, as Patrick had plainly pointed out, we want certainty. We want to be able to base our lives on some things that are certain and not wonder if we're going to get the rug pulled out from under us every step that we take because we don't know what truth is. We truly desire what's true, but it's mixed with the fear that, well, I might be following something that's not true. I might be believing something that I thought was true, but now it's not. And I believe that tension is what makes it fertile ground to receive this crazy philosophical mindset that truth is relative, there are no absolute truths, and basically morality is something that we make up as we go along. One of the illustrations that is often used to demonstrate this mindset, and I've mentioned this in the interview with Patrick, is this illustration that there's this elephant. I don't know why they picked an elephant, but all right, they went with an elephant. And you have all these blind people. Why they had to be all blind, I don't know. Maybe insisting we're all blind instinctively. And that these blind people each touch a piece of this elephant. And so one touches the tail and feels the tail and explains an elephant in the terms of it's like a tail. But another one grabs the ear, describes the ear, and says, no, an elephant is like the ear that I have touched and described. Someone else will grab the trunk and say, no, you're both wrong. I feel it, and it looks like it's a trunk. And that's what an elephant is like. And someone else has a leg, and so on. It can continue as many parts as there are to an elephant in this illustration. But the point is to demonstrate that each person is telling the truth about what they have, even though it's not explaining the whole beast, if you will. So no one's wrong is basically the conclusion, because they're all telling the truth, and therefore the guy with the tail can't impose upon the guy with the ear, my truth is better than your truth. That's sort of the illustration that's used. However, the very same illustration actually defeats the purpose of the illustration if you really think it through. They're all blind. How are you going to trust someone who's blind to tell you what they see? They have a limited access to knowledge. Therefore, they're going to give you a limited explanation of what they're examining. So they're all blind. They all have this disadvantage. But there's one elephant. The premise of the whole illustration has to admit that there is an elephant, and it is absolutely an elephant. It's not like it's an elephant one day and a giraffe the next, or that it's a snake the next, and it confuses their conclusions. They each have a piece of something that's absolute. They're all dealing with an elephant. If someone was to come along who could actually see and go, well, it's an elephant, you've got the tail, you've got the ear, you've got the leg, you've got the trunk, you've got the tusk, etc., etc. He's the one who's telling an absolute truth. Now, those who are blind can still argue if they want. You can impose your view on me. This is what I see. Again, see. You're blind. This is what I see, and therefore it's true. Look, it's look, because I'm blind. I'm grabbing a tail. And I'm describing exactly how it is. And the guy with absolute truth will go, you're right. That's exactly how the tail of the whole elephant looks. Even its own illustration defeats the argument in the end. Perhaps you have seen memes on social media that demonstrate this principle in another way. If you write a number 6, it's a 6, but if you turn it upside down, it's now a number 9. So you have one standing on one end saying the number is a 6, and you have a guy on the other end standing saying, no, it's a number 9. And they're arguing back and forth, and of course the smirky little comment is, truth is perception, which is partly true. Again, its own illustration has to be turned up on its head. The absolute truth is there is a number 6, and the absolute truth is there's a number 9. And you write number 6 one way, and you write number 9 one way. If those truths didn't exist, there wouldn't be the argument in the first place. Now, if I stand to where it looks like a 6, it's a 6. If I were to move to the other side and look at it, it would be a 9. You know what those are called? Absolute truths. The absolute truth is if you stand over there, it looks like this number. It becomes this number. If you stand over here, it becomes this number. That's what the truth is. It has nothing to do with perception. It's knowing the bigger picture. Of course, if I only see it, and I don't know you're over there on the other side somehow, and it's a 6, and you tell me it's a 9, I'm going to resist it. But if you tell me, well, I'm standing on this side, and it looks like a 9, come over here and look. Yeah, you're right. And then when we go over here, it looks like a 6. You know what we did? We discovered the greater truth in its greater revelation. Now today, of course, you had two pastors talking on a podcast, and our religion basically came to the forefront, and that was, one of the topics we discussed on this podcast is religion. One of the things that he has asserted, and something I would concur with, is that the church at large, the concepts and doctrines in which it teaches, are absolute truths. We are presenting them like truth, not, well, this is our perspective and this is how we see it. No, we're declaring something like a greater revelation. For example, we consider the revelation of Jesus Christ and what he has given to us as akin to the person who comes along to a bunch of blind people who are grasping at an elephant, and he goes, well, this is what the whole elephant looks like. He's declaring a greater revelation. Jesus shows us a greater revelation of who God is than at any other time hand before in history. And when he came along, he is presenting something that enlightens the world with a more greater understanding of God. Now, in your comparative religions in most universities, they're usually designed like this. They explain the religions, and then they compare them, and they go and marvel at, look at all the similarities. I guess all religion is the same. That's the conclusion they want you to have. However, when you get to the Christian, and I've even seen the Jewish section, all of a sudden you begin to see what they would kind of paint as detrimental differences in those religions. I mean, they won't even do that to the Islamic religion. That makes the category of how nice. But for some reason, the Jewish faith and the Christian faith are specifically targeted as, but their differences are just outlandish. But all religions are the same. And that's kind of how they present comparative religion in the studies in most universities. But let's think about it for a moment. Just because things are similar doesn't mean they're the exact same. That's why they're different. That's why they have different names. That's why they have different concepts. Not every of them believe in a heaven. Not every one of them believe in a hell. Some believe in reincarnation, some do not. Some practice outward sacrifice, some do not. Many have different moralistic viewpoints. Some have different philosophical starting points. So obviously, if you do an honest comparison of religions, you see there are just as many differences as similarities. But then you might wonder, well, what provides for the similarities then? It's because they're like a bunch of blind men trying to figure out what an elephant looks like. Except in this case, it's God or spirituality or transcendence. There's this greater need within the human soul to try to fulfill that thing that is missing, that only comes from a spiritual state. When you're blind and don't know the full extent of how that's supposed to be, you're going to be reaching out like you're blind, and maybe you'll grab a hold of something, and you'll begin to describe it, and that forms the essence of a religion, but it only has a piece of something that is greater, but it's made by men who are blind. The great claim of the Christian faith is Jesus is the incarnate of God with man, meaning God became man, and he is referred to as the Son of God. When he talks about the things and teaches about the things of heaven and the ways of God and the kingdom of God and the purpose of man and how one should live, he wasn't making up a new religion. He was giving a more complete revelation of godly things. Before that, and ever since then, even those who insist on going about this method, it's like you've been blind and you're grabbing at people. Jesus even taught about people being spiritually blind. Even those who were very religious, you're spiritually blind. And as the saying goes, I was blind, but now I see, is very applicable, what I'm talking about today in this essay segment. Without God actually showing us who God is, we are like a bunch of blind people reaching out in the dark, grabbing at something, trying to explain the things of God, and treating it like that's our personal truth. if we even grab a hold of something that's partially true, we only have it in part, and we still don't see. But in Jesus Christ, the great Christian claim is, the absolute truth that they propose is this: that we were blind, but now we see. We were grasping at the things of God, and when we could not get to who God is or where God is on our own accord because of our blindness, God came to us. God became man. Emmanuel, that you hear during Christmas time, means God with us. And that Jesus came and gave us a greater revelation of who God is, what his intentions are, and what his intentions for us are. And it is like a man who came in and said, hey, y'all are looking at an elephant. That's sort of what Jesus did. He came in and said, you're trying this. You have these religious systems. You have these beliefs going on. You got these moral ideas. But I tell you, he says it with authority because he has the authority of God. And he opens up and illuminates everything for us. He simplifies things a lot of times to expressions like, and you've heard them, like it's called the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do to you. Perhaps you've heard that. Even if you don't believe in the Christian system, and even if you don't want to believe in the Christian system, it's hard for you to argue against that as being a pretty solid pillar of understanding morality, because you personally understand it yourself directly. Like Patrick said in the interview, you can have a guy standing in line for a convention to talk about how there's no morality and you can't force your morality on me, will then complain that somebody cut them off in line. Why? Because he wants to be treated a certain way. And if you don't want to be cut in line, well, maybe you shouldn't cut off other people in line. That's the essence of what Jesus taught is morality, and we understand that at the most basic core in our humanity. So when we make claims about absolute truths, we're not saying it of a position of I'm a know-it-all and you don't know. We're simply declaring that we believe what Jesus, the Son of God, had taught us, that it is logical, it is coherent, it is defensible. It has been defended for thousands of years over the same objections that keep coming up over and over again, but no one's listening to the answer. Why? The blindfold is still on. But we say it with certainty. The Church of Jesus Christ, and it's not a particular denomination, I'm talking about God's actual bride on earth, the people that belong to him, have answers, and they're going to give them to you straight, and they're going to state them like they are actual truths. And we are not going to apologize for that.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.